Hello everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for today's SEDS online webinar. We're really excited to have Peter Talling here. He is a professor in submarine geohazards in the Department of Earth Sciences, and he also is split between the Department of Earth Sciences and the Department of Geography. He is based at Durham University in the UK, and his work really spans a few different fields of earth and environmental sciences. And he focuses on Earth's surface processes, atmospheric science, geophysics, so a nice sort of scattering of different types of research that he's a part of. And he has a lot of scholarly output if you look online, as I did, as writing this bio. So he's engaged in a lot of different fields. He integrates different types of scientific perspectives, and he really likes to employ a collaborative research style, so involving lots of different types of experts in different scientific domains. So we're excited to have him. Peter, thank you so much. We will give the floor to you, and I look forward to your talk.
No, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for everybody's time. I'll try and give you some of the sense of excitement of trying to measure directly active processes, mainly turbidity currents, in the deep sea. So these are very difficult places to work. They're expensive to get there with ships. The events themselves are relatively infrequent. But I can try and show you that this is possible, and we can measure some of the most impressive sedimentary events on the planet in action. I'll talk about flows that carry sediment for over 1,000 kilometers at speeds of 5 to 8 meters per second, the longest sediment flows yet measured in action. So hopefully I can try and convey some of that excitement and some of the more recent scientific results from that work. And I'm going to focus it on this area offshore from West Africa, which is the Congo Submarine Canyon and Channel. It continues from the mouth of the Congo River on the right there, one of the largest rivers on the planet, and it heads out all the way to the deep sea to an area called the Lobe at the end of the channel, about 1,000 kilometers away from shore. And I'll talk about, at the second part of the presentation, about the measurements from the very end of that channel, hence the talk title. But I thought I'd zoom out a little bit at the beginning, just set the scene. And first of all, I need to thank all the people who've been involved in collecting the data sets that I'm going to talk about. They're particularly from 2 research cruises in 2024 and last year in 2025, who are listed at the bottom. There are big teams that work together on the vessels. We work 12-hour shifts. There are 2 shifts, so it's 24/7. It's pretty intensive. And everybody listed there is thanked for all of those efforts. You can see Sanam and Maywen on the right getting the joy of deep sea mud as it comes back on board the vessel. It's also the talk I'm going to give part of a broader picture where we've been going out to different field sites around the world over the last 10 years to measure turbidity currents in action as they occur. So I'm going to bring in some of the data that's been collected by a much wider team, only some of whom are there, a big international team. So my thanks go to them as well. It's a real team effort. So traditionally, it was always thought that turbidity currents would be too difficult to measure in action. There's a quote at the top from a seminal review from Ben Neller and Claire Buckey in the year 2000 that geologically significant turbidity currents are impractical, impossible to study directly. And hopefully I can show at least that that's not the case and how you can do it and what you can learn from them. And people also thought in the second quote that it might not be possible to measure big ones. You can measure the smaller ones, the weaker ones, but I'm going to show you events today that are pretty powerful, that erode the seabed to 20 meters depth, that go for 1,000 kilometers, and that they're full large-scale events that flush submarine canyons. It was also said it's just too expensive to do, but all of the projects I'll talk about are funded by standard UK research grants. I think it's exciting at the moment, not just because you can measure these events, but also what it means for other things. So we have field data now that we can compare back to laboratory experiments, another classical way of trying to understand these flows. We're starting to see that the front of the faster flows are dense sediment suspensions, and that guides what sort of experiments are most useful to do. So it's kind of exciting. We've got measurements from the field now. We can go back to the lab experiments and redesign them, if you like, to be closer to their submarine cousins. And similarly, if we're modeling, we've got field data sets we can compare back to the models. So it's exciting in that sense. And as a geologist, I'm originally an outcrop geologist, we're also able to core the deposits from the flows that we've measured. So when I was an outcrop geologist, we'd go to an outcrop, there might be 5 different opinions on how the outcrop should have formed. And I was always at the back thinking, I'm not sure how you know. But now we can test at least some of those models for how deposits form against real observations from the flow themselves. So I think it's a bit like having the first ever measurements from rivers if you were working on rivers. And if you'd previously had no measurements from any river, and you're beginning to get the first ones from a small stream, maybe a medium-sized river, and now we have the first ones from a big river. So it's a bit like being in that situation. It's quite exciting. So the outline of the talk itself, the first part with this preamble, and I'll talk a little bit about the methods that we use to measure turbidity currents in action on the sea floor. I'll then introduce the wider project that we've had in the Congo Submarine Canyon, some key results from the past cruises, the past campaigns. And then in the final part, I will talk about the most recent stuff from our last 2 research cruises in 2024 and 25, which is the title of the talk. So just as background, the main methods, this is your main research tool. This is a research vessel. This is the Royal Research Ship James Cook. It's a beautiful research vessel. It's incredibly well run, and it's a real privilege to use. But when you're out on the ship, you'll be out on this thing for maybe 20 or 30 days. It's about 100 meters long. It's very different to doing outcrop fieldwork. You can't really go anywhere. You back deck to have a walk on or the front deck. And it's also really intensive. So you're working 24/7. It's one of the most exciting scientific activities I've seen, most exciting activities of all, but it's also one of the most tiring. So what we do on the ship is the following. To try and measure these underwater flows on the seabed, we place on the seabed moorings that have a float at the top. So in the top figures show one of these moorings sat on the back deck of the ship, and we lower it over the side and then drop it to the seabed. The float at the top is buoyant, and the big weight at the bottom, the anchor, sits on the seabed. There's a chain in between with a release on it that we can ping from the ship, so it releases in a year's time. And then our sensors are in the buoy at the top, and this is what's called an ADCP, an acoustic Doppler current profiler. It uses an acoustic pulse and the Doppler shift on that pulse to measure the speed of particles. And it does that in a profile above the seabed. So it produces time series of velocities at different heights above the seabed. And this is a turbidity current I'll talk about later. This is several days, almost a week of flow, speeds of up to 1 meter per second. And this is the sort of data that these things can produce. I'll also talk about time-lapse bathymetry. So in our studies over the last 10 years, we've combined moorings with repeat time-lapse surveys of the seabed. This is one from the Congo Canyon with deposits in blue and erosion in red. And this is a landslide that fell off the side of the canyon between our 2 surveys. So we can see what the geomorphology is doing and how the seabed is evolving. We take traditional sediment cores on the right there. Some of the team, I think from 2 years ago, Rebecca and Meg and Bernard, looking at one of the cores that we've just recently taken up from the seabed. We also look at the seabed in terms of taking shallow bottom profiler lines. There's one here I'll talk about later, combine that with the cores. We also place, and I'll talk about this in some detail, ocean bottom seismometers, OBS. And they are, as we're finding in recent years, a really good way of measuring these flows in action without having your sensor within the flow itself. They can sit off to the side, out of harm's way, but still measure the flows. And then finally, I included a picture of a carousel here that you can lower to the seabed with bottles in it that allow you to trap samples from within an active flow. My colleague Matthew Cartini and Sana McAllen have also kind of pioneered this to actually make direct samples of the flows themselves. So these are the sorts of techniques that we will be using. So what I'll do now is I'll just introduce a little bit about the Congo Canyon project from the older cruises in 2019, 2020, and 2024, the first 3 of the 4 cruises. It all started actually even before then, where they were hoping to take an oil and gas pipeline, a gas pipeline across the Congo Canyon. Somebody was able to get an ADCP mooring in the canyon. They were testing to see whether it was too hazardous to put the pipeline across the canyon. And what they found was remarkable. The turbidity currents in the Congo Canyon, in this older data from 2010, 2013, were almost a week long. They sustained a speed of a meter per second for over a week. And the flows were active not just for a fraction of the time, but they're active for almost 20 or 30% of the time. So based on that information, they decided to directionally drill and take the gas pipeline underneath the canyon. But this was really seminal data. It was the first of its type from the deep sea. So our whole project is really kind of started with that data set, which we're very grateful to get from the folks at Chevron. There are various papers on that initial work. The flow shown in the top left is a turbidity current that's about 80 meters high. The colors are the velocities that were measured from the ADCP over a period of almost a week. And there's a little fast bit at the front of 2 or 3 meters per second, which is running away from everything else within the turbidity current. And instead of lab currents, where the body of the current tends to be the fastest bit and it feeds the head at the front, in these field data, it's the bit at the front that's running away from everything else. We also think the bit at the front, which we call the frontal cell, drives the event. It's the thing that's generating everything that's kind of being left behind, the trail of dust behind it. And it's probably dense. So in other places worldwide, we now have good evidence that it's dense. It's maybe 10% or more sediment concentration in a layer at the bottom. And that really matters if you're modeling these events in terms of the physics of the sediment flow, or indeed if you're creating them in the lab. But the rest of it is probably quite dilute. But it's that little front bit, the frontal cell, that's driving everything. So that was some of the preliminary work. And then based on that, we were able to go to the funding bodies, the NERC in the UK, and go all in. So we put a series of 11 ADCP moorings along the canyon where we could get permits. There were some gaps where we couldn't get permits. In the initial cruise, which was in 2019, we also started to time-lapse map the seafloor. And with these sorts of projects, you have to be able to take some risks to get some rewards. It's classic high risk, high reward science. So we deployed all of those moorings in September, October 2019. They recorded some smaller flows, but on January the 14th to 16th, we started to get information back from ADCP floats which had risen to the surface and which had been broken. And they were now floating around the ocean. Each one of these pins is one of those 11 moorings which has broken free and come to the surface. So in February 2020, and this is just before the pandemic kicked in, all of our equipment from that deployment was floating around the surface of the ocean. We thought there was no chance to get this back. And over the next few months, we actually managed to get 9 of the 11 moorings back. That's probably one of the more remarkable facets of this project. And we actually got the data from the ADCP itself. But when these things rise to the surface, they actually email us the time at which they got to the surface. And from that, we can backtrack out when they were hit by something on the seabed. And we later actually corroborated that against the actual ADCP data on the sensor itself when we physically got them back. And they were able to show us some remarkable data. So this is a plot of the speed of the front of the turbidity current, its front velocity, between the different ADCP mooring sites from the time they broke, but also later from the ADCP data itself. Several submarine cables, which are shown in the middle here, also broke. And from all that data, we're able to show that the big flow that really broke everything traveled at about 5 meters per second for the first 500 kilometers, and then ramped up its speed to about 8 meters per second by about 1,000 or 1,100 kilometers. So we're able to show that the big turbidity currents, if they start with speeds of about 4 or 5 meters per second, can grow in size and become even faster. They can ignite. And then we'd also measured some smaller flows initially before things broke, and we're able to show that they dissipate. So we're able to test various models that have been around for a while for how these huge events work. We're also able to repeat time-lapse a year later, and it was remarkable. So this is the axis of the upper canyon, and red shows areas that have been eroded where the seabed has dropped between the surveys. And for much of this distance, the seabed was eroded to depths of more than or equal to 20 meters. So all of that eroded material was swept out the canyon. when you add it all together along the whole canyon, it's about 2.6 cubic kilometers of sediment. And that's about 1/3 as much as all the rivers in the entire world produce for a whole year added together. It's a phenomenal amount of sediment swept into the deep sea by that huge event. We also calculated the amount of organic carbon that's in there, and it's even more impressive. It's roughly equal to the amount of terrestrial, it's mainly terrestrial, organic carbon that is supplied to the ocean by all of the rivers for a whole year. So these are very big flows that carry prodigious amounts of sediment and indeed organic carbon in just one event. So that was kind of stuff that we'd published a while ago. More recently, we got into data not from the moorings that had broken, but from the ocean bottom seismometers that we had also deployed in 2019. But they were able to be deployed a few kilometers outside the axis of the canyon. And originally we thought they might record signals acoustically via a hydrophone, but it turns out that turbidity currents are much better at producing signals from ground shaking, from the vibrations that seismometers classically record for earthquakes and other things. There's a really characteristic signal from turbidity currents between 2 and 10 hertz. So here's an OBS being lowered over the side of the ship, eventually placed on the seabed. It's placed a couple of kilometers outside the axis of the canyon. And in the canyon, we actually had an ADCP mooring. And for the events that didn't break the mooring, we can use them as ground truthing for what the OBS then measures. So the figure on the left is from a paper that Meg Baper published in 2024, and it shows all of the OBS data in a sequence from closest to shore at the top, that's the first OBS site, all the way down to the OBS site that's 1,000 kilometers from shore in the deep ocean. Along the x-axis is the time in hours. So there's 64 hours there, nearly 3 days. And there's a second plot on the right from another event in March of 2020. The one on the left is the January event in 2020. And the colors here are the strength of the shaking of the OBS. So they light up when there's a distinctive turbidity current signal. So these basically look into the internal structure of the event and show you what's going on. And we can see that this initial pulse that broke everything else is actually about 12 hours long. It doesn't kind of get stretched. It doesn't increase that duration too much, although it kind of coalesces a few different pulses. There's another pulse a few days later. There are some interesting things in here I'll come back to later, and indeed in this area here. And then a later event comes through. But we could also get the front speed from these data as well. They're similar to the front speeds from the mooring breaks, but we get it for more flows. And they produced pretty uniform flow speeds, considering this flow ran out for 1,000 kilometers. This later flow in March goes at about 5 meters per second for all of that 1,000 odd kilometers. So we ended up looking at that data and concluding that at least the March flow has some sort of equilibrium. It keeps a happy front speed of about 5 meters per second. The bit that lights up the seismometer is about the same duration, even though it's moving for 1,000 kilometers down the system. We think it hits some sort of near equilibrium where the amount of sediment being eroded into the front of the flow, the powerful bit that makes the OBS signal, is about the same as the stuff that's being transported into the cloud behind. And there's some sort of near equilibrium or close to auto-suspension, if you like. We called it a traveling wave model. More recently, there's a paper led by Pascal Kuneth, who's done this amazing job looking in more detail at those OBS data. So he used the azimuth direction of the signal that's picked up by the OBS to look at pulses that start up canyon and rotate that direction until they go down canyon. Then a new pulse arrives from up canyon and that direction rotates to down canyon. So he's picking up pulses that are moving past the OBS. And within that OBS data, that first few hours, there are numerous pulses every 5 to 30 minutes, typically every 5 to 10 minutes. And surprisingly, the fastest bit of that pulsing frontal cell is not right at the front. It's actually quite a long way behind the front. And these pulses, there are many, many pulses, are providing momentum into the front of the flow and helping it to keep moving forward and sustaining that fast frontal speed for 1,000 kilometers. Snow avalanches have a similar behavior where pulses in the rear of the avalanche are faster and they reach the front, and then the front is off again, and these pulses carry the momentum. So that was recently published, and it gives us more insight to how these really big flows are working. Pascal has also gone on to look at the OBSs in terms of a different signal. So we were initially puzzled by it because it wasn't like the signals we were getting from the vibrations coming out of the channel. And it appears that in some cases, for the deep sea OBS at least, they were engulfed by the flow, and there's a different sort of signal here. You can see it has these peaks that are really pulsed, even more finer scale pulsing. And we think these are periods when this particular OBS, which is called OBS 7, was engulfed. The neighboring OBS, which is further up canyon, OBS 6, wasn't engulfed by the flow itself as it spilled out the channel. But this OBS and the ones further down were engulfed by the flow. And the flow itself is engulfing the OBS and vibrating it. And Pascal has been able to show that this overspill onto the levees itself persisted for an even longer period of several weeks, and it consists of these repeated, numerous, short-lived pulses. So most levee deposits tend to be a single couplet of sand and silt or fine-grained, but we think that hidden within that, there might be this really pulsed behavior of these overspilling turbidity currents. And Pascal and his colleagues in Germany were also able to look at the turbulence spectra of those vibrations of the OBS. So it has this characteristic 5/3 inertial subrange. You only see that when the turbidity current's engulfing the OBS, and they were able to calculate the turbulence and its strength and the turbulence mixing of these flows that are leaving the channel and engulfing our OBS sites. So that work is published very recently, just accepted in Geophysical Research Letters. It's the first data of its type for the overspill of turbidity currents directly measured out of a submarine channel. And it's from one of these extremely big canyon flushing flows. They also, the OBSs are able to track collapses on the flanks of the canyon that we see in the time-lapse bathymetry. So the red is erosion between 2019 and 2020. Not only does the axis of the canyon erode, but you get these cauliflower-shaped areas on the flank of the canyon, which also eroded, and they're kind of collapses. And the OBS that we deployed, one of them happened to be opposite this. This was just good luck. And the OBS is able to record the duration of that flank collapse, whether it eats its way back up slope, and then how it triggers flows that move down slope, again from the orientation of the signal that's reaching the OBS. So these OBSs have produced some really exciting results from those initial studies. So then to move on to get on to the main part of the talk, the title at least. So I'll now talk about the most recent data that we've only just started to analyze from 2024, to 2025. So we had a big research cruise in 2024, and we went back again in 2025. And these are the last two of the 4 research cruises that we've had to the Congo Canyon. So we were trying in the last stages of the project to do something different. We'd measured the big flows that ripped their way through the canyon, but we'd never placed moorings in a tight array beyond the end of the channel on the area that's called a lobe. So we tried to do something different with these 2 cruises, and we were able to deploy 4 moorings shown in white on the left there in an array, together with 2 moorings from our French colleagues at Ifremer, who've played a key part of the whole enterprise. And we deployed that set of moorings in 2024 and came back again in 2025 to pick them up. So when you're designing these sorts of experiments, it's always a bit of a gamble. It always makes you wonder if you've done the right thing. At one end, if you put the moorings too close to the main channel head, the flows may break them. But if you put them too far out, then it's even worse in many ways. They measure nothing, no flows happen. You've wasted your time completely. So we were agonizing over where to put them, how far up, how far down. And this is where we ended up. So the lower panel shows a zoom in. This is the end of the main submarine channel. This is one of our older mooring sites from previous cruises. And we put the 2 French Ifremer moorings on the levees on either side of the end of the channel. We put one of the moorings from the UK in the middle there. And then the channel kind of fades out a bit. Then it has a nick point. It's a little bit steeper. Then it fades out a bit. And then it's steeper again over a distance of maybe 20 or 30 kilometers. And we put the other 3 moorings at these distances. I was agonizing all year about whether we'd gone too far out or too far in, whether we'd get any data at all. So we're trying to answer the question, how frequent are flows at the end of the channel, but also what happens through this array. This is the first data of its type, or attempt to collect data of its type at the end of a channel. And this zooms in a little bit. The first mooring is at the end of the well-developed channel, up at the top here, M1. It's flanked by 2 levee moorings on the side there. Then we have an area where the flow is less, the channel is less well developed. Then we have a point at M3 where it's better developed. There's kind of a ragged edged nick point here, some form of slope failure. And then finally at M4, this is in the final part of the channel. So we kind of left them for a year and we went back again. So it's always a really tense business when you bring the moorings back on deck. So the first 2 moorings that came from the levees were the Ifremer moorings, PG1 and PG2. And they had this beautiful time series of flows overtopping the channel and reaching these sites on the levee. There was a first flow in March 2024. It lasts a couple of weeks, 3 weeks. And then in the temperature data, and indeed in the ADCP data, the velocity data as well, we had 2 even bigger flows coming in December 25 and then March 25. And we were cock-a-hoop. We'd got 3 big flows. Remarkably, they comprised 15% of the whole time. We were worried we wouldn't get anything, but the end of this channel, over 1,000 kilometers from the coastline, was active in that year for 15% of the time. So almost as active as the top of the canyon. So we were really excited to then bring out from the seabed the canyon axis moorings. And these moorings had the first mooring here, M1, had a beautiful image, I'll show in a second, of flow 1. This is the ADCP velocity data. This is in millimeters per second, so 1,000 is a meter per second. This first event, sustained those sorts of speeds over a series of 3 or 4 or 5 days. The time scale at the bottom is a day between each of those ticks. I'll talk about the weird structure here where the velocity maximum is a long way above the seabed. And this is an inversion, which you can also do from the ADCP, from the backscatter intensity to get sediment concentration. It's really stratified. So we were really pleased. I'll come back to this event. This is the first direct measurements of flows coming out at the end of a submarine channel. It has this really interesting structure. But when we came to pick up the memory card coming out from that first mooring, it stopped about here, the one in the axis of the channel. And these later flows were not recorded. So when we were on the ship, it's not quite what we want. We've got 1 great flow and 1 great mooring. We then thought we've got 3 more moorings to pick up. It'll be in those. But the next mooring, we had a problem with the memory card. In the next mooring, there was a problem where we think the acoustic beam was again leaking, so that the battery life wasn't as long as we wanted. We again got this first flow. So it was relatively incomplete. I will still regret the fact that these ADCPs didn't record the second and third flow as well, but the first flow is still pretty magnificent. So here it is. This is the ADCP data. This is the time series of velocity up to a meter per second. This is the seabed, and this is the height above the seabed of the turbidity current going up to 40 meters. And you can see it has this sharp velocity maximum, really sharp, with lower velocities in blue underneath and indeed above. And this is about 3 or 4 days in duration. And this is the sediment concentration that you can invert from it in grams per litre. So it's got this dense lower part and a less dense upper part, but it's still pretty dilute. It's got a maximum speed that gets almost up to 1.5 meters per second. So we got our answer. The end of this submarine channel is highly active, remarkably active. It's active for 15% of the time. And it has these flows with this unusual sort of profile. So we were instantly thinking back to a paper that Rob Durrell and colleagues had published, where they had proposed, based on measuring saline flows in the Black Sea, so things without sediment in, or indeed looking at other atmospheric gravity currents, that a process could occur where the velocity maximum becomes very sharp, so-called self-sharpening. And that's what we were seeing in this incredibly sharp velocity maximum here as well. And the basic model that Robert put out with his colleagues was that the sharp velocity maximum is generated because these flows are density stratified. It's a bit like a stratified flow in the atmosphere going over a mountain. When you perturb them, then they generate waves along the density interfaces in that stratified fluid, and those waves propagate into the center of the flow. If the wave speed is equal to the velocity of the surrounding flow itself, the waves can break, and then they can transfer their momentum into the faster velocity maximum part of the flow. And this process can produce a very stepped density profile and a self-sharpened velocity profile. So I think that's what we saw. And it's one of the unusual examples. It doesn't usually happen like this, where you go and measure something in the field and it actually looks like what somebody's proposed in the models. So it's really pleased. I was really pleased for Rob and his team that when we've gone out and measured it, we've seen the feature that they predicted would be there. And we're working with them now to try and analyze this in a little bit more detail. And with the team down in Loughborough, so that includes Charlie Lloyd and Ed Skevington as well. So we think we have this distinctive velocity profile that has this self-sharpening. We'd also have to say that it's the first time we've seen it in any of the data sets. So we've been in other places around the world at 4 or 5 or 6 other sites, and they've never had that distinct velocity maximum. They tend to have a more classical shape with a velocity maximum near the bed, more like the laboratory experiments. But this was one of the main things that we've seen, that these flows at the end of the channel can have this very distinctive velocity profile. And we think they're very dilute. They're almost like the saline flows without sediment. But this process where the velocity maximum can self-sharpen is something that can happen in turbidity currents, and it has happened in these flows in the deep sea. So that was the first thing we did from those recent 2024 to 2025 data. We also went back in and tried to ballpark the amount of sediment that was being carried. So we did that in 2 ways. First of all, from the ADCP data, we have the average flow velocity. We can use a balance between the driving force, which is the density of the flow, the gradient of the seabed and the thickness of the flow, and the frictional forces. We define a friction coefficient, and we can backtrack that balance between the driving force and the observed velocities such that we can estimate the sediment concentration. That's the so-called Shazy approach, which has been used in a similar way for rivers for over 100 years. And if we use that, we end up getting about 8 million tons of sediment passing the first mooring at the end of the channel, and maybe 2 million tons arriving at the last mooring about 20 kilometers further out. We can also use a second method that uses that ADCP data, but in a different way. We use the strength of the backscatter that comes back to the ADCP to estimate the amount of sediment in the water column. We have to assume a sediment grain size, which is a fairly big assumption, but we have trap samples from one of the moorings. And if we do that, we get something pretty similar, maybe 5 million tons at the first mooring, 0.2 million tons at the last mooring. And that first flow, sorry, is about 12% of the total duration. So it's about 2 months out of 14 months. And assuming the sediment fluxes were comparable in the later flows, we know how long they lasted, we can estimate the amount of sediment that goes through in 14 months, or indeed turn that into a 12-month flux. We end up with a value at the first mooring of about 40 odd to 50 odd million tons per year. And the interesting thing about that calculation is that the amount of suspended sediment coming out of the river 1,000 kilometers away at the coastline is about the same. It's about 40 odd million tons, at least the suspended load. So what we're seeing, at least to the first order ballpark, acknowledging the assumptions, so this is kind of first order, is the amount of sediment coming out of this submarine channel at 5 kilometers water depth, over 1,000 kilometers from shore, is about what the river is putting in at the top, at least for this 1 year period. So it's remarkably efficient. It's indeed slightly higher sediment coming out the end than the average river input at the top. So we've got this strange structure to the flow, this velocity sharpening. That was exciting. We've got this remarkable sediment flux balance, also interesting. And then the final thing is this. So as the moorings were coming on deck and we were finding out that the memory card hadn't worked in one of them, or indeed the battery life was not as good as we'd hoped in some of the others, it was pretty frustrating. You go all around the world twice, you spend all this time and effort. So I'd walked away a little bit. I made a cup of tea in true British fashion, and I was observing the sub-bottom profiler screen, basically as something to do to take my mind off it. And then this feature popped up. So we're at the end of the channel. We're in an area that was previously flat in 2024. And the sub-bottom profiler gives you a profile of the first few tens of meters below the seabed. And this feature here is almost like a child's drawing of a submarine channel, popped up on the screen, and it wasn't there in 2024 at the same location. So the sub-bottom profiler and the repeat sub-bottom profiler lines are picking up a new channel that had grown. And that channel had grown a distance of 10 kilometers in the previous 12 months. Here it is again. It's about 2 meters thick and maybe 2 kilometers wide. It has a kind of set of reflections in the middle. This is the 2024 survey in the same place, and it's just not there. In some places it was there, but very small, and it's grown bigger in those 12 months. In other places it just wasn't there at all. So we think this new channel had grown by 10 kilometers in distance. It's built its way out. When we try to core it, it's very difficult to core because it's so soupy. But our main core that has a 1-ton head weight blasted through it, and it didn't collect the sediment within this package. But the little trigger core, that's our little trigger arm, has a much lower weight, and it did. So it's made of lots and lots and lots of little muddy turbidites in the axis with little silty bases. And this is how the channel has grown. So this is the first time-lapse data directly of how submarine channels grow, at least this muddy system. So what happened, these are the lines in 2024 and the ones we repeated in 2025, is we can compare them. And what we see is that we have a series of kind of reaches where the channel is well developed, less well developed, goes through nick points, better developed, less well developed. But at the end here is a new channel that's made of these little muddy turbidites that's growing. So previous models for how channels grow have suggested you may get scour features that amalgamate, you eventually make the channel. And on a big scale, that's kind of happening through this reach. But also, we've got this little muddy channel that's building out at the end, which is purely depositional. There's no erosion in there at all. So this is kind of a new way of looking at how submarine channels grow. It's very different to past models, which I'm showing on the right, which are based on other surveys in other parts of the world. This is one from a small system, sandy system in California. This is an AUV survey from something flown just above the seabed. So it's ultra high resolution, and there's no channel anywhere close to the type of thing that we saw growing in the Congo system. So we have maybe different processes of channel growth in muddy systems than to these channels grown in sandy systems. So just to bring that together, looking at time, the dimensions of submarine channels can rival or exceed the largest rivers on land. They're probably slightly bigger, and they produce the largest sediment accumulations on Earth. But we never really measured what came out the end of them and how that flow then worked as it came out the end. So these data are exciting because they're the first of their kind. We find that the end of this submarine channel, which is 1,000 kilometers from shore, is remarkably active for 15% of the time during a 14-month period. And remarkably as well, the amount of sediment coming out the end appears to be about as much as the river is putting in at the top on average, with some uncertainties. So it's really efficient. And that efficiency of sediment that's charged with organic carbon is important because it affects the unusual deep sea life that you find at the end of the channel. It causes the channel to grow by 10 kilometers. And that channel growth is happening by this really unusual mechanism that we weren't expecting, of this muddy channel that's kind of building its way out, that's purely depositional. So this is kind of the take home from all of that work. And hopefully I can try and inspire people to go out and measure these flows and other processes on the seabed, other parts of the world, because we now have the tools and the ability to do this. So I'll leave it there with the conclusions. and maybe hand it back to the folks running the session, and happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Peter. That was a lovely presentation. Maybe if you want to keep your slides up,
Okay.
just so then you can flip back in case you want to refer to anything for any questions. So everybody in the audience, the chat is now open. You can type your questions, and just remember to put send to all so that we can all see it. I will read them out to Peter and then he can get to his answering. Also, when you type in a question, if you can add in where you are joining us from, we always love to see sort of the reach of SEDS Online. So it's always fun. Okay, we already have a question. Howard Fellman wants to know if input and output of sediment is equal, how is there overflow to make levees?
Yeah, it's a good question. So if you think that the sediment can only come from the river, then you have a mass balance problem. I think what it's telling us is some of the sediment in the system is coming from the river, but the system is also creating its own sediment within the canyon. So the canyon walls are retreating, there's erosion on the base, so that there's a second source of sediment which is internal within the system, that there's a canyon there and the canyon is being eroded. So that may allow this balance to work. And I guess the other one is this is a 1 year period, so you'd have to look at longer periods to see what the longer term average is. But it's still striking in that 1 year period that, as far as we can tell, about the same amount is coming out as goes in from the river. If
Yeah,
that
I'm
makes sense.
curious, sort of as a follow-up question from me, I guess, from Howard's question, is how to figure out, or if anybody's working to figure out how much of that sediment that gets delivered all the way to the bottom of the channel is representing stuff from the mouth or representing more from erosional material.
I think it's a very good question. The one we know about is the big flow, so we're able to do the time lapse mapping, and the
Hmm.
amount of sediment eroded along the system is more than 50 times the annual sediment load from the river. So
Okay.
even if you assume that that big flow started with an amount of sediment that's equal to the whole annual supply of sediment from the Congo River, it's quite a lot, you'd still
Yeah.
have to bulk it
That's
up 50 times to get the amount that we saw eroded. So I think the big flows are bulking up to a huge degree.
right. Okay, awesome. Okay, back to the chat. We have Joanna joining us from Colorado. Hey, Joanna. She says, thank you for the great presentation. Are non-erosional mud flows more common globally, or is the Congo system unique? We'll start with that one. She has a follow-up question to that, but let's go with that first.
It's also a very good question. This is the first big system in the deep sea that we have this data for at this resolution. There aren't any other data sets. So for big muddy systems in the deep sea, n equals 1, and this is how this one is working. This is almost the excitement of doing this stuff. There aren't many data sets of the
A
type.
lot to compare to, yeah.
Yeah. But for
Um,
sandy systems, they're different. We have 4 or 5 good data sets now. So they are definitely different.
so her follow-up question is, can such flows influence carbon storage in deep sea sediments?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So the big flow that flushed through the canyon and eroded all that material, that 50 times bulking, the amount of organic carbon, which is pretty much all terrestrial, is about the same amount of terrestrial organic carbon as that we thought was buried in all of the oceans everywhere for a year. So it's a huge amount of organic carbon that's being flushed to the deep sea. You could say that all that carbon is just old carbon, fossil carbon, so it doesn't really matter. You're just moving it from one place to another. But when you look, and Meg Baker and Sophie Haag and others have done this in detail, at the composition of the organic carbon, it's as fresh, has a bigger fresh component. It's just as young as the organic carbon coming out of the river. So it does matter in terms of global carbon cycles and drawdown of CO2 from the atmosphere. So there are very big fluxes of organic carbon being carried by these turbidity current systems, sometimes in just a single event. And that's also important for seabed life because organic carbon underpins most, not all, but most deep sea life.
Yeah, absolutely. That's interesting to think about as well, because if one of the questions is sort of how much of the sediment material is representing things from upstream what's coming out of the mouth or eroded material. Yet if your organic material is representing mostly stuff from the mouth, then it's kind of an interesting question to,
Yeah,
what the
totally.
delivery system is of the two components.
I think it tells you the stuff that's the river deposits stuff for a few years in the upper canyon, and then it's flushed to the deep sea a few years later.
Hmm.
But in the bigger picture, it's very efficient transfer from the river down to the deep sea. It doesn't linger in the upper canyon for very long.
Yeah. Okay, I better get back to the back to the chat with all of the questions. Yako says, thanks, Pete. Excited as usual. He's joining us from Bangor. Wondering why the lobe flows were not erosional at 1.5 meters per second, or is this because the depositional channels formed further downstream than where you have the ADCP data from?
Yeah, no, that's spot on. So there are two ADCP data sets that we got back. One is from the proximal area at the end of the channel, and that's 1.5 meters per second. But at the end of the ADCP array, the flow is only going at about 40 centimeters per second. Often it's going at 20 or 30 or less centimeters per second. So where we had the new channel, the ADCP that we had at the beginning of that reach is a much slower flow velocity. And you're right, it's not 1.5 meters per second. It's a few tens of centimeters per second.
Hmm. Okay, on to the next question. Kate Giles wants to know, well, she says, thanks for an enlightening talk, Peter. Since the flows are active over 15 to 20% of the time, how does the submarine system tie to the river flux system and timing?
Yeah, also a very good question. We're really interested in what triggers these flows, and the answer seems to be it's a combination of river floods and spring tides. So the river flood brings a lot of sediment into the canyon head, but it doesn't plunge, it doesn't trigger anything directly. The system waits, and it waits for a week or several months, and then at the next big spring tide, it spits out one of these flows. And not all of them, but 4 out of 5 are on the big spring tides of the year, and they all seem to come within a few months or a couple of years after really big river floods. So it's all down to tides and river floods, but they don't correlate one to one with river floods because the tide is the thing that finally pushes them over the edge.
Sure, sort of reaching a threshold and then
Yeah,
that triggers.
the river flood primes it, and then it
Yeah,
sits there for a while, and then the tide is able to just kick it over the edge.
super. Okay. Next question is from Jesse from Denver area. Fascinating high velocity, so high above the seabed. Not familiar with the self-sharpening. Would this be a zone of more laminar flow? And what do concentrations do at that boundary?
Also, a very good question. Um, I would go back. There's the paper by Rob Durrell, which I can send through, which explains this in more detail. It's not a laminar layer. It's basically a density stratified flow where waves form on the interfaces and where those waves propagate away from the bed, rather like a flow in the atmosphere going over a mountain. As you go higher in the atmosphere, you still get waves. And where those waves break on the velocity maximum, they transfer momentum to the velocity maximum and sharpen it. So it's a turbulent flow. It's not laminar. And you're right, that velocity maximum is a really surprisingly high distance above the bed, given the overall flow thickness, and it's really sharp.
Okay, next question. Nadiza, sorry if that pronunciation is off, joining us from University of Bremen. Thank you for an exciting talk. This is interesting that less developed parts of a channel do not seem to become more developed as the channel extends in the Congo Channel. How is this explained?
Also, a good point. We were expecting the channel is kind of discontinuous. It's well developed in kind of steeper nick points, and then it fades out in between. And we were expecting the flows just to come through and kind of connect all of that together. And there actually is an example of a new nick point extending the channel in between older than 2019, but it doesn't happen very much. It doesn't happen within the resolution of our surveying techniques. And at 5 kilometers water depth, we're not able to resolve more than maybe 5 meters or so of vertical
Mhm.
change. So I'd caveat it saying I think that process probably is happening to some degree, but it's not as important, as dramatic as this additional channel occurring right at the far end of those amalgamating scours.
Sure. Okay. Okay, we have Julian joining us from the southwest of France, Total Energies. Thanks, Pete, for this fantastic talk and your data. You clearly passed on your excitement to us. One question, gravity flows are known to become transitional in the distal
Mm.
fan reaches, for example, the channel mouth and lobes. Similarly, we know from the subsurface in modern systems that in those distal reaches, changes in flow rheology may appear. Could the strange velocity profile in your flow be related to one or the other channels in flow dynamics?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. We were wondering about that on the ship. So these flows are full of cohesive mud, and as they slow down, I mean, Jaco Bass and others have shown this, many others, that they can really profoundly affect how the flow behaves. They can collapse turbulence. It can become very different. It can transition. So I think I haven't got the slide. I'm trying to look for it. We had two ADCP data sets from that first flow, and the second one that's further out lacks that sharp velocity maximum, and the flow is much thinner and closer to the bed. We think it's collapsing into something that's closer to perhaps a fluid mud-like layer, and that we're capturing 2 points in that transition. We would love to have had all four ADCPs measure that transition, but we've only got it in two places. But I think it's likely to be happening. The other point is also from older French work. The lobe is remarkable because there's lots of submarine landsliding going on because all this sediment accumulation is so fast. Even though it's effectively a flat gradient, it still fails. So in terms of the classical linked debrites, where you have a turbidite deposit with a debrite in it, this lobe, at least this muddy lobe, is extremely good at generating those debrites locally. They don't necessarily have to travel through the whole system. There are lots of scars of landslides on the seabed.
Okay. Good. Next question is from George from Portland, Oregon. Great presentation. Were any of the source events associated with seismic events? Here in Cascadia, the literature seems to tie every offshore turbidite to a postulated seismic event.
So we can be clear on that for Congo. There were no earthquakes. So none of these events are triggered by earthquakes. There are no earthquakes actually looked within 1,000 kilometers at the right time. So it's
Yeah.
definitely not earthquake related. People have suggested that pulsed turbidity currents are characteristic of earthquake shaking. And I can show you some extremely good pulsing in turbidity currents that have nothing to do with earthquakes.
In
With
the
the
Congo.
yeah, in the Congo. With Cascadia, this is an aside. There's a lot of debate and controversy over whether those turbidites are generated by earthquakes or by other mechanisms. There are lots of other things that could generate them, and indeed controversy over whether every earthquake is recorded in there. And I think there's recent work looking at the correlations. I've personally never been convinced that those Cascadia turbidites definitely correlate. I think you could match them up in lots of different ways. So when you get into the devil in the detail of that Cascadia data set, it's not at all clear to me that they are definitely earthquake triggered. And that's an interesting question that needs further research. It's possible, but it's definitely not proven.
Super. Okay. Jesse Melik wants to ask, referring to velocity anomalies, are they like Kevin Helmholtz instability?
Yeah, so there are the KH waves on the top of the flow. You can almost see them in the ADCP data. You're also turbulently mixing momentum through the flow, and that's breaking of those kind of waves on density interfaces is driving this self-sharpening. So the KH billows will definitely be part of the mixing process on the upper part of the flow. There are also internal tides in this canyon. You can see the flow reacting in its upper surface to those internal tides every 6 hours as well. So also a good point, a good question.
Yeah. Okay, a follow-up from Howard Fellman, who's joining us from Fort Collins, Colorado. A lot of Colorado people joining today. Cool. Is there a change in the proportion of sand versus mud at the start versus the end channel?
It's pretty sandy all the way down in the axis in the distal part, but in the upper part, when we first cored it, the first 100 kilometers, it was really muddy. So we were really surprised. We were worried our corer would bend when it hit sand, but it was coming back with beautiful muddy cores. So that was in 2019 and 2020. In 2019, before the big flow, we went back more recently and merrily tried to core the same places, expecting them to be muddy, and they'd suddenly become a tank of sand after the big events. So I think the really big canyon flushing flows leave a trail of sand through the whole system. And then the smaller flows make the upper canyon muddy for intervening periods until a new big flow just rips through the whole thing and leaves a trail of sand going all the way out to the lobe. But in the distal 500 kilometers of the system and on the lobe, the axis of the channel is very sandy.
Okay. Next question. What could be the next target for direct measurements of turbidity flows?
Also a good question. It's always more fun is where next. We've got a cruise this summer going to the Mississippi Canyon and a series of canyons on the east coast of the US. We're doing that to see in particular how active canyons are. And the consensus in the past has been the Mississippi Canyon is inactive. My colleague Matthew Cartini is going to the Amazon Submarine Canyon to see if that's active. But everywhere we've gone so far, the activity has been far greater than we were ever expecting. So we're going to see if canyons that are 100 or 300 kilometers offshore can be just as active as canyons like Monterey Canyon that are right next to shore. We also need to go to places that have hyperpycnal flows and broaden out the end members that we've so far managed to accumulate.
Sure. Yeah, that would be great. Okay. Thank you for a brilliant talk. How do you evaluate the history of deep flows and their relations with climate regimes? Joining us from Israel.
I guess there's one control globally in that sea level, when it goes up and down, controls how many canyons are connected to rivers. We're showing the Congo Canyon, which is connected to a river, is active in the modern high stand. And perhaps some other canyons are a bit more active than we thought, but sea level will be a control. And then I guess river floods are affected by climate, and they are the priming mechanism for the big flows. But it's not as simple as one turbidity current equals one flood. It's far more complicated than that. But on average, turbidity current frequency is affected by river floods and sediment input.
Okay, next question is from Julian again, I think in the southwest of France, if I remember correctly. Coming back to the Levy overbank seismometer record, with those long durations recorded and the many pulses or changes in overbank flow intensity, should we reconsider how we read thin bedded turbidites? Stacks of millimeter to decimeter thick thin beds may well be the record of one event.
No, also a really good question. That was one that we thought about a lot on the ship as well. Immediately you see it. I think what's happening is that the pulsing does occur, but it's in a very, very dilute flow that's entirely mud. And my guess is if that makes a deposit, it will just make a series of thin mud layers that all amalgamate into one muddy unit, that unless you do some incredibly detailed grain size work, you won't see the fluctuations in grain size. And we do have sediment cores from directly underneath both the ADCP and next to the OBS. And our French colleagues are kind of starting to analyze those sediment cores. We can also have sediment trap samples, which we definitely know in the last 12 years. And we're not seeing like, hundreds of laminations in each one of the mud layers, but it might be so subtle we just can't see it. We can't sample it to slice it up thin enough. And the human eye probably won't be able to see it anyway. But it's a really good question. It's exactly what we wondered immediately we saw the pulsing.
You there, Peter?
I'm there. I'm coming out. I don't know if
Okay, it cut out maybe. So Kate from Austin, Texas wants to know what's happening with the bed loads in this submarine system. Also, any indication of contrite flows?
Yeah, also very good question. So in terms of bed load, what we think the bigger flows have is not really a classical bed load layer like a river has. They've got a much thicker, more debris flow-like layer near the bed at the front, which is the first 20 minutes or so of the flow. And then beyond that, everything is dilute. So we think that's actually best recorded in some other of the field data sites, including Monterey Canyon. And also when you do the Shazy equation, you get concentrations of 10% for that bit at the front and other places. So it's not really classical bed load with a single layer of grains. It's something a bit denser than that. But it's a very good question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, super. We are going to cut it there. We have one more that just came in. Okay, we'll get to it. One more question from Jesse. Would you please share some key references about the self-sharpening and KH phenomenon?
Sure. There's a paper by Rob Durrell that I can try. Can I add it to the chat?
You should be able to add to the chat. So Jesse, if you wanted to stay on
yeah,
and wait for Peter to add that to the chat, we can do it that way. We can also try and put these citations in the comment box of the YouTube video or the description of our YouTube video when it's on there.
yeah.
Okay, thank you everybody. Peter, thank you again for this wonderful talk. Obviously, a lot of interest, a lot of questions, and yeah, just scientific inquiry that people are excited about. So we'll close for today. Our next SEDS Online event will be our student webinar on February 25th in just 2 weeks. So join us again in 2 weeks and we will hear from our students regarding some new data and insight on AI and big data sets, how we can process them, how AI can be used as an informative tool in geosciences. So we look forward to seeing you all then.